sound very dull. So another quote that I like, sometimes academics take very exciting, engaging, and important work and present it in such a way that it looks like a butterfly squashed between two pieces of glass. We have these wonderful ideas and we get into the details of who are the scholars and what is the history of the field and the technical aspects of the method. And we forget about the colorful, wonderful butterfly that we started off with. And we're not doing enough to let this butterfly come across as nice as it is. So I'll talk about some of the things that we can do to try and not squash our butterfly. What I find is very useful for me in my own writing is to make sure that I understand exactly what I want to say. And I find that often when I have problems writing a certain sentence or a certain paragraph or getting a certain idea across, it's because I have a general idea of what I want to say. I know where I want to end. I know what my conclusions are. But when I think about certain aspects, I might not be very precise and exact in understanding what am I trying to say. And a good way of testing if you understand what you want to say is what a colleague of mine, Dov Eden, calls the mother-in-law test, which is basically to try and describe your study, your research, your manuscript to somebody that is outside your field, not even an academic like your mother-in-law, or a friend, or a colleague that's not necessarily in academia, and see if you can describe your study in a way that they will understand. Obviously, you won't be able to use technical jargon because they're not familiar with this jargon. You are supposed to assume that you're talking to somebody that's relatively intelligent. Hopefully your mother-in-law is. And if you manage to sail through the journey of describing your study to somebody outside the field, that is a good indication that you probably know what you're talking about. So that's a good starting point. Overall, when I think about the purposes of the introduction, I identify two main things that you're trying to achieve. The first thing, which will come early on in the introduction, is to demonstrate that you have an interesting question. You're going to talk about the problem that you're addressing in your study. What is the real life problem that your study helps address? How does it advance our understanding of something that is important and interesting? The second purpose of the introduction is to demonstrate that you have an answer to the question. So you present early on the answer, the question, what is the research question? And you already have an answer, which is your research hypothesis. You're not sure that this is actually the correct response. You have good reason to believe that it is, but you're conducting the study in order to confirm the hypothesis. But throughout the entire introduction, what you're trying to do is convince your reader that the hypothesis is a reasonable answer to the research question. Once you have these two ideas in mind, what you're going to be doing when you write the introduction is paving the path between the introduction, the opening paragraph that will present the research question, and the hypotheses that generally come at the end of the introduction. And basically you're taking the reader by the hand and you're leading this reader. And you should assume that the reader maybe doesn't see very well, so you have to guide very carefully from the question to the hypothesis without having any conceptual leaps, without having the reader bump the head in the door or falling into a ditch. You have to make sure that you have a clear and smooth transition from sentence to sentence, from paragraph to paragraph, from section to section. One of the most common problems that I see in articles that I review or in my students' writing, and sometimes in my own writing when I look at a paper that I set aside for a while, is that we have these conceptual leaps. We understand what we want to say, and we take for granted that our reader knows what goes on in our head. And we have a certain sentence, and then the next sentence, the connection between the two isn't clear. We need to make sure that these transitions are clear not only to us, but also to our reader that comes with a different background, with a different understanding, and that didn't think about this topic the same way we thought about it. Another thing we want to make sure is we should try to write simply, great simplicity. So a quote attributed to Da Vinci is that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. You're not trying to show in your paper that you have a great vocabulary. You're not trying to show that you can use big words and big sentences. You want to convey your ideas in as simple a manner as possible. If you can say the same thing in one short sentence or in one long paragraph, you should always choose the one short sentence. Again, I'm setting some boundary conditions here. These are the norms in my field, and I imagine in other fields as well, but there could be fields where the norms for writing may be different. So each one of you should be familiar with the norms in your own field. In general, I do believe that simplicity goes a long way to making for a more convincing and compelling argument. So you begin in the opening paragraph in describing what the paper is about. You want to describe something that is appealing and interesting on the one hand, but you still want your description to be close enough to what you're actually studying. You don't want to make a big promise about studying something that is fascinating, but then when the reader gets to the point of looking at your study, the reader sees that you didn't really study what you promised that you'll be studying. So you have to pay attention to both of these things. Here are some things that you don't want to do in your opening paragraph. You don't want to review the whole history of the field. Unless this is a paper about history, the reader doesn't care about the last 50 years of research and what the various researchers have done. The researcher cares about, especially in the opening paragraph, what is the problem that you will be solving? What is the interesting idea that you have in mind? For this purpose also, don't use technical jargon. You'll have enough time later on in the introduction to define your concepts and to use the technical terms. But when you first start your paper, you want to talk very plainly in language that even people that are not reading and writing articles will understand. So you don't want to use complex arguments. You also don't want to state the obvious. So I study organizational change, and many manuscripts begin with, many organizations face organizational changes. Well, this is of course true, but it's not very interesting and it doesn't really grab the reader. You also don't want to oversell. I mentioned this before. You don't want to promise things in your opening paragraph that you don't actually fulfill later on in the paper, diverging from what you actually studied. So let's look at two examples of opening paragraphs in papers that I recently reviewed as an editor. I'll read them. So historically, there have been a number of barriers preventing indigenous populations from participating fully in the workforce, resulting in a large gap in the employment rates and well-being outcomes between indigenous and non-indigenous people across the globe. Job security and a good working environment not only provide economic security, but also contribute to the psychological and physical well-being of the individuals and of their families. Further, people's work and careers provide opportunities for psychological satisfactions and or frustrations that can spill over into family and personal life. Therefore, it is vital that organizations create workplace environments that afford the indigenous workforce the same opportunities for positive work experiences as their non-indigenous counterparts. Now, this isn't a terrible opening paragraph, but it's not very good for a number of reasons. First of all, it begins again with some brief review of the history of this topic. And in the end, we're not really clear about what the study is about. We know that it's important to give indigenous populations a good working environment, but we don't understand what the problem that the study is about. Let's look at another example. Stress, which is an important ascendant research topic in recent years, has been paid close attention to by researchers of organizational behavior. How to help workers establish a safe and healthy working environment is the primary purpose of promoting workplace health psychology. Apart from the importance of academic development, this topic is also necessary for practical management. The problem of long working hours has not improved, thus workers' reaction to work stress is increasing and cases of suspected workforce overwork are frequent. When employees face workplace health problems, it will affect their personal health and quality of life, reduce their work performance, and increase the operating costs for enterprise operations. Therefore, how to improve workers' workplace health has long been an important issue that both academic researchers and practical managers hope to deal with. Again, this is not a terrible paragraph, but it spends too much time talking about what researchers are interested in. In our opening paragraph, we want to talk about what people in the world are interested in. not necessarily researchers. By the way, I can see that people are sending chat messages, but I can't really see them. So if something is important for me to pay attention to, if you could, Ahmad, maybe just let me know by speaking out. If you're not speaking out, I'm assuming that everything is okay.
Okay.
Thanks. So this isn't a terrible paragraph, but let me talk about what things you would want to emphasize. First of all, keep it simple. Both of these paragraphs seem to be kind of long-winded. They get to a lot of detail, are not necessarily important for understanding the problem that the study is addressing. Try to think about what stirred up your passion with a topic to begin with. Why did you think that this is a fascinating idea that you wanted to research? Remember that and convey that passion in the opening paragraph. Talk about real life problems, not about what researchers are interested in, and try to use relatable and relevant examples. So let me show you now two other examples that I think are very appealing and engaging. Imagine that one morning your telephone rings and you find yourself speaking with a king of Sweden. Surprisingly good English, that you have been selected as this year's recipient of a Nobel Prize. How would you feel, and how long would you feel that way? Although some things are better than instant celebrity and a significant bank deposit, most people would be hard-pressed to name three, and thus most people would probably expect this news to create a sharp and lasting upturn in their emotional lives. Now imagine that the telephone call is from your college president, who regrets to inform you, in surprisingly good English, that the Board of Regents has dissolved your department, revoked your appointment, and stored your books in little cardboard boxes in the hallway. How would you feel, and how long would you feel that way? Losing one's livelihood has all of the hallmarks of a major catastrophe, and most people would probably expect this news to have an enduring negative impact on their emotional lives. Now, immediately, this paragraph engages us, right? So it talks to us as people, not necessarily as scholars in the lab, and it gives a very vivid set of examples, one very positive example and one negative example, that makes us imagine this kind of situation. Now, this is a study about the difference between what people believe they will feel when they're first told something, when they're told to imagine it, versus what they feel when they're actually told this thing. And this is a wonderful way of making the technical jargon. Here's another example. The need to delay gratification, control impulses, and modulate emotional expression is the earliest and most ubiquitous demand that society places on the developing child, and success at many life tasks depends critically on the individual's mastery of such ego control. In this article, we looked back at the life histories of children who were failing to achieve such mastery, who at age 10 were still reacting to childhood frustration and adult authority with explosive temper tantrums. We sought to discover whether such ill-tempered children become ill-tempered adults, and if they do, what the causes and consequences of such continuity are. This is a short paragraph where Ben is actually one of the authors. So you want to spend a lot of time thinking about how to begin your study. What is the opening paragraph? In fact, the recommendation is to spend a lot more time over the first 5 or 6 pages of your manuscript than you do over the rest of the paper. You might want to spend even a month focusing on those first 5, 6 pages where you really want to get the reader's attention, and they will be more forgiving for mistakes later on if they buy into your study early on. Some other examples of specific ways to structure sentences in the opening statements. So here are 2 ways of describing the same thing, where one of them really draws our attention to something that is not the focus of the paper. So several years, Ekman, Izzard, Tommins, and Zionk pointed to psychology's neglect of the affects and their expression. The paper is not about Ekman, Izzard, Tompkins, and Zionk. It's about the psychology of affect and the expression of affect. So if this is what the sentence is about, That's what you should focus on. For example, individuals differ radically from one another in the degree to which they are willing and able to express their emotions. And then in parentheses, you will put Ekman, Izzard, and so forth. But you don't want them as a central part of the sentence. Here are some other examples. Research in the first compliance paradigm has focused on the effects of pre-decisional alternatives and incentive magnitude. This is very technical. It's very hard to follow. It's okay to have the sentence later on, but not in your opening paragraph. Another example. Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance received a great deal of attention during the latter part of the 20th century. The paper is not about the latter part of the 20th century. It's about cognitive dissonance. So see if you can use the opening paragraph to explain in plain language what you're talking about and then lead to the concept of cognitive dissonance. So for example, the individual who holds two beliefs that are inconsistent with one another may feel uncomfortable. For example, the person who knows that he or she enjoys smoking but believes it to be unhealthy may experience discomfort arising from the inconsistency or disharmony between these two thoughts or cognitions. This feeling of discomfort was called cognitive dissonance by social psychologist Leon Festinger, who suggested that individuals will be motivated to remove this dissonance in whatever way they can. You're conveying the same ideas, but now your reader actually understands what you're talking about, why it's important, and why it's interesting. Once you have the opening paragraph, which is not a small task, that's where you want to go on to structure your main arguments leading up to your research hypotheses. You want to start broad. You describe the general idea that you're talking about. So some examples from a paper that I've written about ambivalence, about organizational change. Begin with a broad statement about what ambivalence is. Ambivalence is defined as an attitude comprising both positive and negative reactions to an object. Later on, I focus on something that is more specific than just ambivalence, and I reach the topic of ambivalence about organizational change. So to date, research on ambivalence in the context of organizational change is very limited. And even more specific, an important factor that distinguishes between types of organizational change is the amount of discretion that individuals have in adopting the change. And later on in the paper, I talk about two types of changes. There's imposed organizational change and voluntary organizational change. And then I become even more specific and make my argument. We suggest that in the context of imposed organizational change, these two influences could conflict with each other and yield ambivalence. So you start with general, and as you progress in the introduction and approach your hypotheses, you become more and more specific. And in this process, you define your main concepts and you make your arguments about why these concepts are related to one another. Another thing I should note, what I'm mentioning here is mostly relevant for empirical research articles. There are, of course, theory articles where you're not trying to test hypotheses. And there are also qualitative research articles that are not tests of hypotheses. I'm a quantitative researcher, so what I'm focusing on today is relevant for quantitative research and empirical research articles. Some things to keep in mind in your literature review. The purpose in the article is not to show that you have read 80 articles and that you're very tired from reading so many papers and books. That may be something you want to do in your master's thesis or in your doctoral dissertation, where you want to show that you're a master, that you're an expert. The purpose of the paper is not to talk about yourself. It's not to talk about how smart you are. It's to talk about what is relevant for the research hypotheses, and only mention those aspects of the articles that you cite, those aspects that are relevant for convincing the reader that your hypotheses make sense. You should assume that your reader is knowledgeable about the topic. Most of your readers are going to be other scholars that publish research in the same field, and refer only to those things that are important for these readers to understand in order to understand your main arguments. So avoid details that are not necessary, and when you talk about other people's research, talk only about those things that are central. Clearly explain what has been done in the field without reviewing the whole field, but We know that there is a lot of research explaining why people resist change. And we know that there is a lot of research explaining why people support change, but we don't really understand when are people ambivalent about it. So this is an example stating what we know, and even more importantly, what don't we know that I will be addressing in my study. Something somewhat technical, but also helps with readability. When you cite other people's paper, where do you want to include these other people in the sentence? So there are different ways that people write. You'll find both of these very frequent and very common in articles. So one way would be to say, ambivalence is an attitude comprising both positive and negative reactions to an object. Another way to say almost the same thing, Kaplan defined ambivalence as an attitude comprising both positive and negative reactions to an object. You're saying the same thing, but in the second sentence, you're giving Kaplan a lot of room in the sentence. The sentence is not about Kaplan. Kaplan may be a great guy, a really smart guy, but the sentence is about ambivalence. So keep Kaplan to the end, in parentheses. When do I still want to include the author within the central part of the sentence where I'm trying to compare between what different people have been saying? So for example, whereas Kaplan defines ambivalence in this way, Miller defines it in another way. In this sentence, the identity of Kaplan and Miller is important because you're contrasting the two. So always try to think about what is important for you to convey in the sentence to try and make the reading easier for the reader. When you end your introduction, that's where you get to your hypotheses. Sometimes if you have several hypotheses, then you first establish one and present it, then move on to present the second one and present it, and then you will end with the last hypothesis. But in general, the introduction will end with, what am I trying to find in my study? And then it's helpful to have a smooth transition to the method to give an overview of your studies. So in study one, I'm going to test ambivalence in a field study in a large organization. In study two, I collect data in the lab to try and support the same hypothesis. So just kind of give a general description of your studies, and that leads to a smooth transition into your method. So this is pretty much how you would want to structure the introduction, and some key things to think about in order to make your writing very readable and very engaging. Now, if you're lucky enough to have your introduction engaging and to have a good study to test your hypotheses, then you will have the foot in the door. Then you will actually get into the step of having the review process relevant for you. You have been invited to revise and resubmit your paper. So as Ahmad said, this is not very frequent, but every now and then it will happen, and this is good news. I actually remember that when I first submitted my very first paper and I received the response from the editor and the reviewers several months later, I read it and I was really disappointed, and I went to my advisor and I said, oh, bad news, they don't like the paper. And she reads the letter and she says, what do you mean? This is wonderful. They're inviting you to revise and resubmit. So the way we write, you're familiar with these letters, they're saying, I read the paper, the reviewers read the paper. Unfortunately, we cannot accept this paper to be published in our journal. However, we are inviting you to revise and resubmit it. This is the sweetest news you can expect to receive in most quality journals. So if you have this opportunity, you really want to make the maximum you can to take advantage of it. And by having an invitation to revise and resubmit your paper, the editor is telling you that he or she believes that this paper can reach a publishable form. The editor can imagine things that you can do to fix the problems that the reviewers and the editor identify in the paper. And if you carefully follow their instructions, in a large percentage of the cases, you can reach a publishable paper. But there's some things that you want to keep in mind in this interaction with the reviewers, things that you want to keep in mind when you design your revision, and especially when you prepare the response to the reviewers, because you're going to have to submit a revision along with a letter explaining everything that you did in order to address or not address the reviewers' comments. And most important is to convey to the reviewers the feeling that you respect the time that they invested in reading your paper. Most reviewers and editors do this for free. They're volunteering their time to read the paper that might not necessarily be the most important thing in their lives. And they want to feel that you respect this time, even if you don't agree with everything that they have to say to you. So some things you don't want to do in your response to the reviewers. If you're very frustrated at them, you don't want to share with them how you feel about them. You can share how you feel with your spouse, with your mother-in-law, but don't tell the reviewers that you think that they're idiots. Maybe they are idiots, but you will never win an argument with the reviewers. The reviewer is always right, even when the reviewer is wrong. So you don't want to be argumentative. You can debate things. You definitely don't have to agree with everything the reviewers and the editors tell you to do. You should respect your own research and your own perspective, and sometimes if you think that the reviewers are wrong, you can talk about it. You can explain why you didn't do something or you tried to do something different. If you try to prove the reviewers wrong, you're just going to antagonize them and make them look at your revision in a negative light, because reviewers are human, just like all of us. This point about not being docile or compliant, again, you don't have to do everything they tell you. I know that some people think, well, the reviewers told me to do it, so I have to do it. Otherwise, my paper won't be accepted. Most reviewers and editors, respect if you make a reasonable explanation of why you're not accepting a certain comment. That's fine. You don't want to have a study that is radically different than the study that you wrote. You know what the ideas that you want to convey are, and you don't want all of them to be lost through the revision process. Another thing you don't want to do is try to minimize the amount of work that you want to do. So don't be lazy. If the reviewers are asking you to do something that is difficult, if it's possible, do it. Of course, if you can't do it, if it's impossible, then explain this and reviewers will understand, because they are authors themselves. I remember, again, the first paper that I submitted, I had initially 4 studies, and in the revision, the reviewers were asking for another study. So Ben was one of my advisors, and he said, if they want one more study, give them 3 more. So that paper ended up having 7 studies instead of the 5 that the reviewers wanted. If you can do what the reviewers are doing, if you can do even more than that, that will go a long way to convincing that you're really taking these comments seriously and are improving your study, and you have a much better chance of getting that paper accepted. So these are the things that you do want to do in your revision. You want to express an understanding of the concerns. Even if you don't agree with them, you want to show that you understand where they're coming from. If you don't understand, and you really tried and you read it again, and you let your colleagues read your paper, and you still don't understand something that they're asking you to do, you can write to the editor and explain what you don't understand, and editors will often respect this and respond and try to help you. They won't necessarily tell you exactly how to write things or what to do, but if something is genuinely not clear, or sometimes reviewers are conflicting one another, one reviewer is telling you to shorten a certain paragraph and the other reviewer is telling you to write it longer, then it's okay to consult with the editor and try to find out what the good path to advance would be. Do your very best, as I mentioned, to fix everything that you can fix. And when you have good grounds not to do it, explain it. And if your reviewers really are reasonable people, which many of them are, you'll have a good chance of convincing them. Ultimately, you want to articulate clearly what you did and what you didn't do. So these are just some insights from my own experience, and hopefully they are useful to you. And if there are any questions, of course, I will be happy to address them.
Let me start by asking you a question. Professor, suppose as an editor, you forward my paper for 3 reviewers, and 2 reviewers suggest a revise and resubmit, and 1 suggests a rejection. After you give me an opportunity to revise and resubmit, will you forward my revised paper to the reviewer who rejected my paper, or only to the 2? Sorry, to the 2 ones who suggested R and R?
I will. The general norm would be to resubmit it, to send it back to all of the reviewers, even the one that recommended a rejection. Mm-hmm. Of course, I'm keeping in mind that if the reviewer didn't like the paper in the first round, they might very well not like it in the second round. And if I'm inviting you to revise and resubmit, that means that I'm not giving too much weight to the rejection. Maybe the comments are legitimate, but I think they can be addressed. So if the reviewer will reject it in the second time, but I will believe that there is significant improvement, and more importantly, if the other, or as importantly, if the other reviewers think that the paper has improved and you address the concerns, that will be fine. Of course, we keep in mind that a reviewer that rejected something is not likely to be very favorable later on, although I have seen cases where initially they recommended a rejection and later on they changed their view. That does happen. It's not rare.
Okay. And one
more thing. The only case where I won't send it to a reviewer is if I really think that the reviewer is not responding in a relevant manner, is not respectful, or is really, if I think it was a mistake to send it to that reviewer to begin with, then I won't send it back to that reviewer.
Okay, thank you. And I had a question, but let us go to the chat room. You have got a couple of questions. Can you go to the chat room, Professor Oreg?
Yes.
Okay.
So the first question I see is about the literature review. Is that right?
Yeah. Is the literature review part of introduction? Is the literature review part of introduction or different?
Yeah. So again, I think this varies by disciplines. In my field, what we call introduction is sometimes misleading because in a book, an introduction can be a short paragraph or a page. In my field, the introduction is everything that comes until the methods section. All of the text from the beginning of the article until the methods section is the introduction, and that includes the literature review. And in most cases in my field, we don't have a separate title, literature review. The whole introduction is a review of literature, but it's not separate because I'm not having a history of the field in one section and then explaining my arguments in a separate section. The whole introduction is about explaining the subject and what I think is the answer to the research question. How are these variables related to one another? And of course, when I'm talking about these variables and these concepts and these relationships, I am reviewing literature. So the literature review is embedded within my formulations, within my conceptual arguments. Hopefully that addresses that question.
Thank you. And I have got one more question. Professor Oreg, when you have two reviews, one rejection and one revise and resubmit, as an editor, how do you make a balance? Which side do you take? For example, if you decide to take the one who rejected the paper or the one who suggested and revise and resubmit, what are the basis of making a decision in such cases?
Well, the two main factors are, first of all, what is my own impression of the study?
Yeah, so you read the whole paper when you get?
I do.
Okay.
I do.
Okay.
Now, sometimes if the reviewers are very homogeneous in their opinions, if they recommend the same thing, then I'm not very thorough. I read the paper, but I'm not as thorough as I would be. If they disagree with each other, I'm going to read the paper much more carefully. So I also give weight to my own impression and my own views. That's one thing. The other concern, or the other thing I keep in mind, is the arguments. So if I have one reviewer recommending a rejection but has very poor arguments, and the other one recommends a revise and resubmit and they have good arguments, I'll go with that, and the other way around. So I don't just look at the recommendation, I look at the content of the recommendation.
Okay, I got it. Thank you. Because in the past, in the past year, I got two such reviews. One from personal review, sorry. The one which I developed and validated a scale for change, recipe, and proactivity. When I got the first initial email from editor, I got one rejection and one revise and resubmit. But the editor said he has read my paper entirely and he thinks there is some merit in my paper.
Good.
The R&R was really substantial. It took me more than 2 months to address the comments. But this year I submitted a paper to review of public personal administration. For this paper, I also got two reviews, one rejection and one revise and resubmit. But the editor took the rejection side, and ultimately my paper got rejected.
Yes, this happens, unfortunately. This happens quite a lot. The editor is not a, even when both reviewers are recommending the same thing, the editor is not just a calculator or a robot saying, well, you know, there are 3 reviewers, 2 said yes, 1 said no, so yes, no. We actually, you know, integrate these different recommendations and make our decision based on the overall impression that we have after we read the paper and we read the reviews. And sometimes our recommendation is not consistent with the reviewer's recommendation.
That's true, thank you. And you have got, I think, 2 more questions.
One. So is the literature review a must for even the qualitative researchers? Again, a literature review is not necessarily a separate section. But when you talk about research, and again, I'm not a qualitative researcher, so I'm not an expert, but I have read a couple of qualitative papers. You review literature, so you do talk about what other people have done. Whenever I mention other people's research, that is a review of the literature, even if it's not having a heading, literature review. Another question, the opinions of several reviewers are not consistent. Some of them want a small change while others need a big change. How should I respond to reviewers who have other opinions when making major changes? Many passages no longer exist. Yeah, I mean, so this is one of those cases where you have a conflict between what different reviewers are asking for. If that is the case, and you really have no idea of how to reconcile these 2 different perspectives, you can seek the advice of the editor. You can say that, and don't just say what to do. Give a plan. Say, I read this, I identify some conflict. What I'm thinking of doing is removing these passages and doing this in this way. Does this make sense? If you have a recommendation for how I can reconcile this, I'll be open to. And if you really spend a lot of time in your thinking before you write this letter, and if you show the editor that you already have a plan, that you know what you want to do, you're not just trying to have the editor solve your problems, the editor will likely help you out if it's a genuine problem that you can't solve on your own.
Yep, probably that's it for today. We have no more questions. Thank you once again, Professor Shaul, for allocating your time. And I personally thank you because you have acted as an informal advisor for me during my PhD, because I really have learned a lot from you. I wished you were my supervisor, but I couldn't make it. Yeah, but hopefully, if possible, maybe we will collaborate in the future on research papers. And good luck with your research. And thank you
very
again.
much. Thank you for the invitation. It was a wonderful opportunity to interact with people that otherwise I would never have a chance to interact with.
Thank you so much, and take care. Thank you for the audience again, and bye-bye.
Goodbye.